Now, welcome to session 9, Alaska Native Separations and Resilience. And we have two fine presentations for this session. The third wasn't able to make it. Our first presenter is Carol Gales, who's going to be telling us rights and responsibilities, the story of Nome's Arctic Native Brotherhood. Carol Gales is a member of the Alaska Historical Society Board. She has lived in Nome since 1996, and she became interested in the history of the Arctic Native Brotherhood while she was researching the history of her former employer, the Norton Sound Health Corporation. So, Carol, take it away.
Okay, thanks. So, hello from Nome, a safe social distance of 682 miles from Cordova. Got the COVID last week, so here I am. I was going to come down there. Anyway, I'm presenting from the traditional homelands of the Sitnasogmut, who have occupied and used this area for countless generations. Nobody knows how many, it's very many. I am conscious of the painful history of injustice and dispossession endured by these people and honor their ongoing connection to the area's lands and waters. And I'm super grateful to be able to live in this community. So my presentation looks into the story of Nome's Arctic Native Brotherhood. In January, this thing is happening again. Let me try again. Interesting. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So in January of 1977, Nome's Arctic Native Brotherhood hosted a banquet to mark its 30th anniversary. The Bering Straits, a local newspaper, noted that, quote, with the Bering Straits Native Corporation and COERIC, the regional nonprofit travel consortium, now in existence, the ANB is reassuming its role as a social and fraternal organization. For 15 of the last 21 years, it was under the guidance of Jerome Trigg. It was under his direction that it carried out the earlier responsibilities of the Claims Act for the Bering Strait area. In this 30th anniversary banquet photo from the Nome Nugget, we see ANB President Emeritus Jerome Trigg at left, Frank Dagnan from the Arctic Native Brotherhood chapter in the village of Unalakleet, and the newly elected ANB President Jerome's son, Jerry Trigg. I moved to Nome in 1996, and prior to doing the research shared in this presentation, only knew of the ANB as a social club with a bar that also hosts an annual Miss ANB pageant and an annual picnic. They give out some scholarships and funeral assistance for families. And most Alaskans probably associate the acronym ANB with the Alaska Native Brotherhood, established in Southeast in 1912. What is the story of the Arctic Native Brotherhood? Lucky for us, the Bering Straits on May 7th, 1977, printed the speech that Jerome Trigg Sr. gave at that 30th anniversary banquet. The speech outlined the history of the Arctic Native Brotherhood. Among other details, Trigg shared that the Arctic Native Brotherhood was formed in 1946, but it was not just a spur-of-the-moment thing. They had been members of the Alaska Native Brotherhood before that, but communications were poor then. A letter took a month to come from Juneau. The Nome chapter was forever asked by our parent organization for lawyer fees that were for the Southeast area, and also the Nome camp did not have representation at ANB meetings. Trigg noted that the newly formed Arctic Native Brotherhood initially had a sisterhood, but then decided to have one organization so that all could be involved in Native affairs together. In the early 1960s, Trigg said, the Arctic Native Brotherhood committed to working on land issues for the Bering Strait region. In 1966, the ANB was part of forming the Alaska Federation of Natives. The ANB gave new meaning to be a native, Trigg said. Many natives began stepping out and becoming part of the economic and political structure of Nome and of our state. They filled school board seats, council seats, state senators and representatives, and even AFN executive positions. This presentation shares some newspaper clippings and additional comments from Trigg's speech related to the history of the Arctic Native Brotherhood in Nome. But I will start briefly with an even older Native organization in Nome, which engaged in some somewhat similar activities before the formation of the ANB here. This earlier organization was begun on December 6th of 1926 at Nome's Methodist Episcopal Church, and for the first few months it was referred to in the Nome Nugget Church News simply as a club for Native boys. note the reference at the bottom to the segregation in the church. Membership of the organization was soon up to 28. The club appears to have been organized partly for religious purposes. The group also hosted events such as a New Year's banquet and a month later, a celebration for Washington's birthday, which became an annual event. In April 1927, just a few months after its founding, the Boys Club hosted a well-advertised native potlatch for the entire community. It was promoted in advance as the big night of the season and was to be a benefit for the clubhouse of the Methodist Mission. Events would include Eskimo dances, blanket tossing, seal hunting, etc. This will be the first entertainment of its kind ever given in Nome, one preview blurb said. It was to happen at Nome's biggest and fanciest venue, the Eagle Hall. Reflecting segregation norms of the day in Nome, Native people were to be provided seating on the lower floor with the balcony reserved for white people. The Nome Nugget article that ran on the day of the event read, "The natives of the city are giving a big potlatch tonight in the Big Eagle Hall, which promises a great deal of entertainment, and a type of entertainment which is out of the ordinary, to say the least." In a lengthy and glowing article covering the event in the following week's Nugget, the Boys Club was for the first time alluded to as the Bering Native Brotherhood. 2 years later, the Bering Native Sisterhood was organized. A March 30th, 1929 article states, "These two organizations are in for a complete educational program for Nome, for a decent school building where our children can be taught cooking, sewing, tanning of skin, skin sewing, etc. We ask the aid of the decent white people of Nome to help us put down the unprincipled white man. Help us and watch us grow into better citizens." In the following week's paper, a lengthy article included statements by several community organizations pressing for a new school for Native students following a grand jury's condemnation of the facility that had been in use, Nome's original Gold Rush Courthouse built in 1900. The Bering Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood wrote of their desires for expanded education. One comment was, quote, "The purpose of these organizations is to help the Eskimo people to become better citizens. And at this time, we ask the Bureau of Education to help us in this and to give our children a broader and more practical education." Ultimately, a new school was built in 1932. In 1933, Territorial Delegate-elect Anthony Diamond met with the Bering Native Brotherhood while on a visit to Nome. The organization must have been seen as politically significant. Then a new organization emerged. On June 19th, 1936, two men from Southeast who were coming through Nome on their way to build a territorial school in the Kotzebue region organized the Nome camp of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood. 16 men and 10 women participated. 3 days later, officers were elected. The Nugget noted that the Alaska Native Brotherhood is a worthy organization and is entitled to the support of all those interested in a better Alaska and a better Nome. Interestingly, though these new organizations had been formed, the Bering Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood were still operating at least 2 years later in 1938. Perhaps the latter organizations continued as primarily social organizations for a time. In the middle 40s, Trigg noted in his speech at the 30th anniversary of the ANB, which at that time was the Alaska Native Brotherhood, was instrumental in getting such signs as "No Natives Allowed" removed. In many of Nome's business places, like the show house, we were not allowed. A possible ANB-related incident happened in March 1944, when Alberta Skank, a half-Irish, half-Native teenager, boldly sat with a white date from the military base in the whites-only section of Nome's segregated Dream Theater, and ultimately spent a night in jail for it. The girl's aunt, Frances Longley, was a leading member of Nome's Alaska Native Sisterhood. The aunt's partner was O.D. Cochran, Nome's territorial senator, who, the following year, introduced the Anti-Discrimination Act in the Territorial Senate. He's shown in the picture standing next to Elizabeth Perodovich. He cited the Dream Theater incident as a prime example of discrimination. So far, I haven't found specifics of ANB's desegregation efforts in Nome, and I don't think the Nome Nugget really ever covered anything like that. In April of 1946, with the Nome camp of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood 10 years old, Elizabeth Perodovich came through after visiting several villages on the Seward Peninsula to start ANB and ANS chapters. Just 7 months later, however, Nome residents formed the Arctic Native Brotherhood for the reasons noted at the beginning of the presentation: slow means of communication with the parent organization in Southeast, lack of representation at parent organization meetings, and requests for help with the Southeast organization's lawyer fees. Their articles of incorporation outlined their purpose: creating recreational programs for adults and children, fostering individual self-improvement in good standards of health and sobriety, and, quote, to undertake such other plans and projects as will develop our self-responsibility and leadership in the attainment of a progressively better social, political, and economic position for ourselves and our posterity. In its first year, the organization was involved in coordinating community events like Nome's 4th of July celebration and a mass chest X-ray effort in the statewide battle against tuberculosis. That same year, the Arctic Native Brotherhood submitted a letter to the Nome Nugget taking issue with comments made by Nome businessmen at an Interior Department hearing that had been held in Nome on the question of establishing a reserve at Shungnuck. In the letter, A&B President Sam Mogg quoted the Anti-Discrimination Act. The organization was boldly speaking out. In February of 1948, the A&B started advertising what they called the biggest show ever staged in Nome with an all-Eskimo cast, an event reminiscent of the Bering Native Brotherhood's Big Show 21 years earlier. An article that ran in the Nugget the day before the event noted that the Arctic Native Brotherhood has active members throughout 2nd Division and have pledged themselves to raise the standard of living and promote social activities for their people. A full-page ad for the event ran in the same edition. Interestingly, the Nugget still sometimes incorrectly referred to the organization as the Alaska Native Brotherhood, a 10-year habit that was hard to break. And I also found that a 2024 Nome Nugget article made the same mistake. A couple of these notices advertised dances, which the A&B held frequently. As Trigg said in his 1977 speech, at that time the natives were taught to give up their traditional ways and turn to the Christian ways. Much dancing of the Virginia reel and card playing took place. This 1951 article covers a congressional committee hearing prior to statehood regarding an early land claims bill being considered by the House. Several Arctic Native Brotherhood representatives testified, largely in support of the proposed bill. A week before the hearing, Nome's Chamber of Commerce and A&B representatives had met to discuss what they would present to the committee. The A&B was engaged and at the table. The organization apparently was inactive for a time in the 50s, however, because in 1960, it was announced that the organization, quote, was just reactivated this year with Jerome Trigg Sr. as president, and the hall is undergoing a refurbishing after several years' disuse, unquote. In 1961, the organization voted to take an active stand in local and state affairs and politics. A month later, the A&B hosted a candidate forum, and at their January 1962 meeting, they were to discuss needed legislation. In February 1962, the Nugget published a letter that A&B President Jerome Trigg sent to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in support of placing a vocational school in Nome. In his letter, he stated that, quote, education of our children is our foremost ideal. We want to see them enabled to carry their own in our ever-changing economy, where opportunity to find employment is becoming the right of the technically trained, which our people are not. In 1967, Sergeant Shriver, head of the Johnson administration's Office of Economic Opportunity, part of the War on Poverty, visited Nome for 4th of July. The following December, the Tundra Times printed a letter that Trigg, as A&B president, had written to Shriver as a follow-up to the Nome visit. In the letter, Trigg thanked Shriver for publicly, quote, declaring Nome as, quote, the worst slum area in America, unquote. Trigg went on to note that prior visiting officials and politicians would meet with the Chamber of Commerce and never see the living conditions of Native people in Nome. Trigg's letter decried the poor, overcrowded, drafty housing, lack of sewer and water, and lack of access to home loans. Quote, it seems that the only thing that was ever thought of about us was welfarism, Trigg noted. We are hoping that some kind of training program will be earmarked for Western Alaska. Thank you for coming to Nome and for all your efforts and interest on behalf of the natives of Alaska. As noted early in this talk, Nome's Arctic Native Brotherhood became actively involved in the formation of AFN and represented the Seward Peninsula and Bering Strait region in the Federation. This photo shows Jerome Trigg and Frank Dagnan of Unalakleet's Arctic Native Brotherhood organization at an AFN meeting in 1967 or 68. In October of 1969, representing the Arctic Native Brotherhood, which he said represented the Seward Peninsula natives, Trigg testified before a field hearing of the Indian Affairs Subcommittee on Alaska Native Land Claims. His testimony included the statement that, quote, we believe our Eskimo lands were illegally sold without our knowledge or consent by a country which had not conquered or lived on those lands. We also believe that our lands were sold by Russia to the United States when neither country had true knowledge of their use, occupation, or ownership. We believe we are justly entitled to payments for non-renewable resources which were removed without benefit to our people and for the lands which are now occupied by the descendants of others. In 1973, the Arctic Native Brotherhood took on a project that produced what Trigg, in his 1977 speech, called one of the first Native history and culture books written. With grants totaling nearly $100,000, A&B supported publication of People of Keweenaw, Legends of the Northern Eskimo. Elder William Aquillick, with help from educator Laurel Bland, committed to paper the oral literature, stories, legends, beliefs, and history that Aquillick had learned from his grandparents, relatives, and others in his community and other villages. Trigg said of the project, along with the busy time of our land struggle, we felt we must not lose sight of our culture. I will close with this slide, which shows how the organization's mission statement evolved over time. As noted in my first slide, with the launch of Bering Straits Native Corporation and the nonprofit Tribal Consortium Keweenaw, A&B returned to its social and fraternal purpose.
Thank you, Carol. Are there questions for Carol? Yes, Brian.
Can you still hear it?
Can you still hear us?
Oh, yes, I can. Yep.
Okay, great. I'll repeat the question for you.
Well, actually, it's not a question. It's just a quick shout out. I interviewed Professor Gunnar Knapp, and he said to be sure to tell you hello.
Did you hear that?
Yes. Say
Okay.
hi back.
Okay. And if there are no other questions at this time, then we'll welcome our next speaker. Greta Helfenstein is a recent graduate of Eastern Washington University. She's got a bachelor's degree in history, and she has presented research at conferences before on fairy tales and on naval exploration in the Pacific Northwest. And I had the pleasure of meeting with her before, while she was writing it. Well, she was talking about Unangan internment during World War II. And so I was very interested in her presentation. And so let's welcome her.
Just click right here to advance. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. In June 1942, Japan invaded and occupied Kiska and Attu, the two westernmost islands on Alaska's Aleutian chain, an archipelago of 69 islands stretching across the North Pacific Ocean. Following these attacks, fear of Japanese invasion and further violence prompted the United States military to move the inhabitants of the Western Aleutian Islands to safety. Most residents were indigenous Anangan people who had inhabited the islands for centuries. Abandoning their homes was difficult, and when they reached the relocation sites, they were met with both disease and devastation. Anangan people were forced to live in overcrowded conditions with a serious lack of proper medical care, food, and supplies. 118 people died as a result of their relocation. Using the recollections and accounts of Anangan people and the works of historians, I aim to highlight the complexities involved in the relocation process amidst the war, and find what led to the decisions that allowed the indigenous Anangan people to be treated in such a way. The intention here is not to label all the official decisions involved with the relocation as ill-intentioned. Evacuation and relocation had to be carried out quickly amidst the panic sparked by the Japanese attacks. Despite the urgency of the matter, though, those in charge of the relocation did have the opportunity to handle the people entrusted to their care differently. The Anangan people were mishandled and neglected, leading to the awful conditions and tragedy experienced in the relocation camps. Long before the wartime relocation of the Anangan people, they had occupied the islands on Alaska's Aleutian chain for thousands of years. The earliest instance of human occupation in the Aleutian Islands is dated to almost 9,000 years ago, and the distinctive Aleutian tradition is dated to 5,500 years ago, archaeologically distinguished by their style of toolmaking. The name Aleut was used by Russian explorers to refer to the native occupants of the islands. However, the present-day native people of the Aleutian Islands often prefer the self-given term Anangax or Anangan. On the Kawalangan tribe of Unalaska's website, they define what the use of that name means to them. The words Anangax, Anangan, or Ananga all mean original people and are also translated to seasiders. The original inhabitants of the islands were skillful hunters, whalers, and fishers, who also gathered birds, mammals, kelp, and berries. Anangan survival depended on extensive and creative use of the animals they hunted, and they relied on the resources provided by the sea as well. Men hunted seal, otter, sea lion, whale, and occasionally a walrus, while women gathered berries, birds, mollusks, wild plants, and grass for basket weaving. Cooperation and preservation were important facets of Anangan life. Food was shared before it could spoil, many tasks required multiple people to complete, and successful hunters shared their catch with other families. Upon the first Russian encounter in 1741, this way of life in Anangan communities was abruptly disrupted. In all of Alaska, the Anangan people were the first to experience contact with Europeans. At the time of this contact, the population of the Anangan people was around 16,000. Soon, Russian fur hunters began sailing to the Aleutian Islands in pursuit of sea otters, foxes, and seals. As the Russian crews expanded their colonial influence, they sailed eastward, and by 1800, only 59 years since the first meeting, the population of the Anangan people had been radically reduced by 80% to about 2,500. This significant loss was due in large part to disease, but also further exacerbated by the exploitation of the Anangan people and the natural resources of their homeland. Anthropologist Dr. Douglas Veltra stated, within just a few decades of the first Russian arrival, Anangacs were a subjugated population. From 1745 to 1799, all able-bodied Anangan men were made to hunt for the Russians, and the families of the hunters were often held captive through the hunts. After inhabiting the islands for thousands of years, the Anangan people had lost their autonomy over the way of life and were forced to work harvesting goods for Russian profit. When Russian fur traders discovered valuable seals on the Pribilov Islands, they moved many Anangan people from their villages to establish work camps on the Pribilovs so they could harvest the seals. By the early 1800s, the seasonal work camps transformed into permanent villages on the two main islands, St. George and St. Paul. After the United States purchased Alaska in 1867, the seal harvest continued to dictate the lives of the Anangan people on the Pribilovs. When the federal government took control of the seal harvest, they continued to regulate several aspects of Anangan lives. One Anangan Pribilov man recalled that every bit of our life was dictated. Whether you're going to leave the island or not, even to get married, you had to get permission from the federal government. They were also pushed to abandon their native customs and subsistence lifestyles and to speak English. Veltra points out that
Start over.
Can you all hear on Zoom? Sorry, I think our internet cut out for a minute there. Let me know if you can hear. Yes, you can hear, Carol says. Great. Sorry about that, everybody. We just Zoom quit completely. Okay. So for one. Oh, no. Sorry, almost there. Sorry about that.
All right. So the War Department was worried that the Aleutian Islands might serve as stepping stones for a Japanese foothold in Alaska. In an attempt to weaken the Japanese hold on these islands, the remaining buildings were set ablaze to destroy the potential enemy asset. Many of the remaining villagers witnessed this destruction while they were being evacuated. As they were taken from their homes, quote, heartbroken villagers watched U.S. servicemen set their homes and church afire so they would not fall into Japanese hands. As the westernmost islands were evacuated after the attacks, the fear of further Japanese invasion spurred relocation on other islands. However, a comprehensive plan for evacuation was not in place. Before the attacks on Attu and Kiska, officials had been largely opposed to any evacuation, thinking quite correctly that it would be alarming and difficult to move people from home so suddenly. General Buckner of the United States Navy stated that evacuating the occupants would be pretty close to destroying them, but they now live under conditions suitable. But after the Japanese attacks on Attu and Kiska, it was decided that relocation of other islands on the Aleutian chain was necessary. Many officials disagreed about the relocation plan and who would be in charge of the evacuees. The Navy and Coast Guard cited other war operations as their priority, and ultimately the responsibility for relocation fell on the shoulders of the Office of Indian Affairs, or OIA, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. The initial intentions of the officials were to protect and evacuate both the Attu and Kiska residents and the inhabitants of any other islands that were in danger of invasion or attack. Commissioner of the OIA, John Collier, recognized his organization's responsibility to protect the native Onongan citizens and the pressure they were under to do so quickly before another attack could take place. During the frantic evacuation proceedings, the general orders of evacuation for residents of the Aleutian Islands transformed into orders of evacuation only for the native people on the Unalaska Island. While evacuating a village on Unalaska, Army Officer Captain Hobart L. Copeland recalled the order that all natives or persons as much as 1/8 native blood were compelled to go. The threat of Japanese attack applied equally to everyone on the islands, not only the native residents. Yet the white residents of Unalaska were not relocated, including Charles Hope, a white man whose native wife was evacuated while he stayed behind. One Onongan man recalled, "There was always one thing on my mind the whole time, was why us Aleuts had to be evacuated when the Caucasians could remain in the village." In total, 881 Onongan people were relocated from their villages on the islands of Attu, Kiska, Atka, Nikolsky, the Pribilofs, and Unalaska. The evacuation process was chaotic. Residents of the islands were often told they had to leave within 24 hours. On the Pribilof Islands, historian Stephanie Hinnerschitz writes, every individual was allowed nothing more than one suitcase and a roll of blankets to bring along with them when the ship departed. Aboard one evacuation ship, the Delaroth, conditions were especially crowded. Passenger Alice Petrovelli remembered that sometimes there was not enough food, and no matter how you tried to keep clean, it was just impossible when there were so many people. We had one bathroom for everybody. There was a lot of sick people and babies. The first casualty of the relocation took place aboard the Delavan, with the death of a 3-day-old baby. While on board the evacuation ships, the passengers were unsure of their final destination, waiting to see where they would be placed. The organizations in charge did not have a concrete plan either. Scrambling to find a site, the officials had failed to locate or prepare proper facilities to house such a large number of evacuees. Despite known problems with the sites chosen, in their haste, officials approved the relocation into camps they knew to be hazardous. According to historian Ryan Madden, a hidden message in the reports on the relocation sites appears to be that although the camp conditions were abhorrent, they were good enough for the natives. 50 evacuees were sent to Seattle, but the remaining 831 people went to what were called duration camps to wait out the war at Hunter Bay, Kilsnoo, Ward Cove, and Burnett Inlet. At Hunter Bay, 300 Yungan people were housed in an old fish cannery and gold mine quarters in 2 dormitory-style buildings under extremely cramped conditions. There was no sewer system, and most buildings had no electricity, heat, windows, or doors, and often holes in the roof. At Killisnoo, the people were housed in a dilapidated herring factory. At Rainbow Institute, people at first slept in tents, then later moved into a burned cannery at Burnett Inlet. At Ward Lake, the evacuees were housed in the former Civilian Conservation Corps camp. In all the locations, people were put up inside inadequate buildings. One former camp resident, Henry Dirks, was 6 when he was relocated to Killisnoo with his family. He remembers that the buildings were drafty and cold. We could see the stars through the cracks in the ceiling. Under these conditions, disease ran rampant among the camp inhabitants, and several residents contracted or died from tuberculosis and pneumonia. The Anangan evacuees had become prisoners, effectively interned in the camps meant to shelter them from harm. Despite the clear need for medical attention and supplies, residents of the duration camps were basically left to fend for themselves. One former camp resident of Hunter Bay recalled the lack of medical aid. Every time someone gets sick, you have to cross that lake to get them to see a doctor. Even people with pneumonia. The doctor can't come over. You have to take the patient over. After visiting Hunter Bay in September of 1943, Alaska Attorney General Henry Roden reported to Governor Ernest Gruning. In short, the situation is shocking. I have seen some tough places in my days in Alaska, but nothing equals the situation at Hunter. Despite this grim assessment of the living conditions of the Anangan evacuees, nothing changed to improve the situation. In total, 118 residents died during relocation. Unnecessary tragedies resulting from lack of proper aid from the organizations responsible for relocating the Anangan evacuees. The Anangan people had been evacuated from the Aleutian Islands to protect them from the enemy threat. In sharp contrast, one Anangan resident staying at Hunter Bay recalled, "There was German prisoners only 40 miles from where we are. They were fed more better than us, we find out. Government." German prisoners of war, enemies, were living in better conditions than the Anangan people the government had been charged with protecting. Camp resident Philemon Tutiakov wrote, "The most galling and demeaning feature is that those in charge regarded us as incapable. At no time throughout this entire process were we given the right to make choices of any kind." Unfortunately, the first return of Anangan people to their homes was not a cause for celebration. In May of 1943, many men from the Pribilof Islands were actually forced to return home and resume the seal harvest for the war effort. Flor Lekanoff remembers government representatives threatening him that the Pribilof men and their families would not be allowed to go home, even after the war, if the men didn't, quote, volunteer their labor. Lekanoff stated that in 43, we took 125,000 seals. That was a big take. The value of those seal furs almost equaled the original purchase price of Alaska. Assistant Fish and Wildlife Service Supervisor Frank Hines thought it awful, but the people who had made that lucrative seal harvest possible were being herded into quarters unfit for pigs, denied adequate medical attention, and even facilities to keep warm. The Pribilof residents were allowed to return permanently in May 1944, and all remaining evacuees were returned by June 1945. However, military historian Stetson Kahn concluded that by 1943, any danger to Alaska and the Western Hemisphere had long since disappeared. Military justification for keeping the Anangan people in turn for their protection had vanished. However, the military had been occupying the evacuated homes to conduct their operations, often using the empty houses as barracks. Historian Ryan Madden surmised that with American soldiers using Yanongan homes, it was more convenient to simply leave the evacuated people where they were, as their fate was a low priority. When the Yanongan internees finally reached home, they were met with further devastation when they found that many of their houses and churches had been vandalized or ransacked. The losses sustained by the Yanongan people were both material and spiritual. Furniture, boats, and fishing gear were missing, damaged, or destroyed. Irreplaceable religious and family heirlooms were gone. And in one case, a man who had purchased an expensive new coal range before being relocated found it missing from his Alaska home. It was later found in an officer's quarters in Umnak, 80 miles away. Also, large quantities of hazardous wartime debris had been left behind on some of the islands, further adding to the damaged landscape that people returned home to. Nothing could rectify the losses sustained by the Yanongan people during their relocation. The loss of material items, family heirlooms, but most devastating, the loss of loved ones, could not be remedied. During the events of World War II, the outside world had taken control of the lives of the Yanongan people, ignoring their welfare and rights to their homelands. Alice Petrovelli recalls, when she told her daughter about her relocation and internment, she didn't believe me because it's not in the history books. Many are well aware of the World War II internment of Japanese Americans, but especially in the lower 48, the Yanongan story has yet to be as widespread. Holly Mioak-Geis, author of Alaska Native Resilience, points out that it is also very important not to label the Yanongan people only as victims, but to also commend them for their survival despite the hardships they endured. Today, the National Park Service recognizes the, quote, tragic episode of Yanongan internment with the Aleutian Islands World War II National Historic Area. In 1996, Congress designated the area to interpret, educate, and inspire present and future generations about the history of the Anangacs and the Aleutian Islands in World War II. The historic area and visitor center are owned and managed by the Unalaska Village Corporation. Through this partnership, the Yanongan people are keepers of their own history, with a historic area that exists to honor Indigenous accounts of the war, who were caught in the crosshairs. Alice Petrovelli wrote of her Yanongan people, "The government sometimes thinks we don't know what we are doing, but we know. I think we know what's best for us, more so than anybody else. Our history has value." Thank you.
We have time for quick questions. Who has a question for Garnet? Yes.
Nothing was, but, what was their first on the Aleutian Peninsula, the U.S. military installation? Or was it?
Are you talking about during the war? In the beginning of the war,
Oh, for them.
yes. The question is, who was there first during the war? Was it the US military or was it the Japanese? From what I know, they didn't have anyone stationed on those furthermost islands, Attu and Kiska. Their operations were located mostly around Dutch Harbor and further in, but they did establish posts out there once there was a Japanese invasion.
And if I could add a little bit
Yeah,
to that.
absolutely.
There was anticipation of the war, so there was a buildup by, even before Pearl Harbor, there was construction in Dutch Harbor on Alaska, and even in the years before, the Native people noticed there was some mysterious presence, and there was suspicion that the Japanese were looking around on the island to see if there might be anything.
From a couple reports I read, they remembered planes flying overhead and that sort of thing. They weren't American operations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there any kind of observation for the thing given out in recent years?
So the question was, have there been any reparations given out to the Anongan people? And the answer is yes. In the 1980s, there was a grant given so you could apply if you had been affected by the relocation, if you were either a child of someone who had been, or if you were actually relocated. I believe you received $12,500 per person, but it happened during the 1980s. And at that point, a lot of the people who had been in their middle age or even older were no longer around to receive that. But there was another payment in the 90s, and it was to rebuild the churches that had been damaged.
So the gentleman here and then.
This part of this story is, now being taught. I feel very good that I think going like my neighbor, I'm 76 years old. I don't think, I follow the story. So I didn't have that focus. He did talk about it. But this part of the story is so important to that U.S. history of war. Usually are being taught, factually being taught.
So the question was, is this story being taught at all at any level in school? And my answer would be that I was completely unfamiliar with this before reading about it. I stumbled across an article and, but beside, there's a recent book that came out that addresses this, but it just came out July of this year. So it's being talked about a little bit now, sort of in that scholarly realm, but as far as being part of the curriculum, I haven't heard of that yet.
Even in Alaska?
Yes, if I could just jump in for a minute.
Yes.
Yes, there have been certainly been efforts, and teachers are very interested in incorporating it into their curriculum. There's a teacher's guide, the National Park Service has put out a teacher's guide for teaching about the travel and activities. And we don't know, just to explain that I'm the former manager of the we've worked really hard to try to get education built into the program and to increase the amount of material that's available for that.
Rachel, will you say that up here so they can hear
Sure.
it too? Because that was really helpful.
Yes.
The Aleutian World War II National Historic Area has produced a number of publications that teachers have been very happy and willing to use in curriculum. So it's an ongoing issue that we've tried to get more an educational component to it, but that is a really important part of the program. Sorry.
Yeah, and I would hope so outside of Alaska as well. And then I noticed there's a question on Zoom and it might answer something for if anyone else has this. They asked what the name of the book is that I was talking about that came out in July. It's called Alaska Native Resilience. And the author is Holly Miyawaka Guys. But there's also a really good article on the New Orleans World War II Museum.org. And the author's name is Stephanie Hinnerschitz on there. And that's a really good article as well.
And then we had yes, the lady in the second to the back row.
So I believe that when they filed a report about both Japanese and Anongan internment at the same time, it was called Personal Justice Denied. And basically it was the findings of to what extent each group had been affected during their internment. And it seems that purely because also of the numbers of Japanese internees versus Anongan internees, most of the booklet's about Japanese internment, and then there's 2 pages for Anongan internment. So I don't know if that full extent was necessarily considered when they were given their payments, but other than that, I wouldn't know.
I'd like to
might have more.
comment
Yeah.
a little bit about that. At the time that the Japanese confinement people were given reparations, there was also an apology to the Japanese who had been interned, and there wasn't an equivalent one for the Unanga. And although I think it was during the Reagan era, and there was a mention that it was too bad what happened to the Aleuts, but there has been in recent years, there was an apology from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically for the Pribilof people who had to go back and do the seal harvest during that time, because those islands were are now under the administration of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What are the percentages of the people, numbers that survived this whole operation? And what's the percentage of those that actually went back out to the island?
So the death toll is 1 in every 10 people died while they were being relocated. So you could say 90% survived. But the amount of people that go back, there's quite a few people who do not return to the villages. I don't have an exact number, but there are several villages that basically were abandoned afterwards because people either found work elsewhere or they moved. So a lot of people went to Juneau to try to work there, or there were places that had been lived in for hundreds of years that were villages of a relatively small population of people, but they weren't inhabited afterwards. You have something to add?
Yes, Philip.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I teach this in grade, and the single best encapsulation I've ever heard.
Thank you so much.
My question is, we always hear this claim made that this is the only piece of American soil that was invaded during World War II. And I've always found it curious because, of course, Alaska was a territory, but so was the Philippines, right? The Philippines were taken over by the Japanese. And I've always presumed that it had to do with there were different kinds of American territories, right? Incorporated, unincorporated, various positions. And I was just curious if you've got anything in the literature that suggests why that claim is made about Alaska, but it was not applied to it.
Okay, so the question for the Zoom people is, why is it talked about, the Alaska Territory talked about as a place for an American land battle during World War II, but not another territory like the Philippines? And in my findings, they often focus on the fact that it was American soil because there were American citizens on it, because the Alaska Native people had been given citizenship there. I can't speak for the Philippines if they had the same citizenship rights at that point. And I also think it comes from analyzing the topic in a contemporary stance and looking at the fact that Alaska is, of course, now American soil, but the Philippines is not. So often I think that's why they say the only land battle on United States soil.
I think that the North American context, right, it feels closer to.
Right. Yes, thank you.
I think Dominic.
I was just gonna say that I think, calling it, yeah, the only American, is probably a little bit of maybe helping with that. It's better described as the only land that, like, what I saw in the U.S.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. The Guam. Yeah.
It's one American.
Right.
All right, one more?
There was a U.S. naval weather station in Kirkland, and the men captured their one guy actually held out for many months. And then when we got through, there was inside the village, the guy got and was shot.
Yeah.
And his wife
I believe that wife was one of the ones captured and taken, you're right, taken to Japan along with the other people. Mhm.
She was taken to another prison in Japan.
For Carol, you're gonna say it out loud. Karen, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. This is a question for Carol. Hi, Carol. Sort of two-part question. One is I was interested that the Alaska Native Brotherhood had chapters as far away as Nome. I didn't realize that. I thought they were just a Southeast organization. And did they have chapters in other places besides Nome, like Kotzebue, Barrow, other places farther afield? And same with the Arctic Native Brotherhood, did they go beyond just Nome?
I'm not an expert on this topic, but the clipping I saw where Elizabeth Prodovich was coming through Nome, having organized chapters in other communities in the second division. I'm going to guess at least that there was some activity for some time. And I know like Unaclede, I believe Unaclede had a chapter as well, but then I think they also became part of the Arctic Native Brotherhood. So yeah, so I'm not an expert, but it is kind of interesting to think about that challenge of being part of that organization and then, being so far away that you can't go to meetings and takes a month to get a letter from Juneau, and, your dues go for worthy causes, but for Southeast, so.
Right. Well, did the Arctic Native Brotherhood go beyond the Nome area? I mean, Cleats close by, but.
I don't think now. I don't know about then, but now it really is just pretty much a social organization. And I've shared this information with a couple of different people in town, and people are really interested in the history because I think it's kind of a lost history, and most people in Nome just think of it as, the bar, the pageant, some other community type activities, but that's about it. So I'm trying to figure out a way to share it with the organization if they have an annual meeting or something.
Great, thanks.
Are there other questions for either Carol or for Greta? Yes.
National Park Service made an effort to honor the people that were related, that were fine, evacuation and stuff like evacuation. I think this is funny to they played a historical marker or any other way on people.
Absolutely, there have been many attempts, and the event that you're speaking of that was organized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but there has been in recent years the National Park Service, over the past 2 decades, really, there's been a huge project that Ray Hudson, who I think is on here, initiated of the Lost Villages project that I also worked on, that emphasized the villages that never were restored after the war, that the villages were gone. As Greta pointed out, some of the villages, the people were never allowed to return to them. And so the National Park Service has undergone a project of revisiting those villages that were never resettled. And we've also held a large commemoration ceremony at the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Dutch Harbor in Unalaska, in which evacuees, all the surviving evacuees were invited, and many of them arrived to remember that time and to commemorate it. So yeah, there have been a number of efforts.
On another nice note, there was a reunion of sorts where they went back to Attu, and it was both Japanese veterans, US veterans, and evacuees who had been relocated.
Yeah, it was actually in Anchorage, but
Right.
it was commemorating the Battle of Attu. All right, well, thank you all. This has been a great session. And thank you to Carol and to Greta for these wonderful presentations.
You're welcome. Good to see everyone.